What happens when a ruthless female billionaire is trapped by a deadly storm and her survival rests entirely in the hands of a struggling father? Her immense wealth cannot buy safety, but his unimaginable sacrifice will change both lives forever. The oppressive weight of the impending Category 5 hurricane hung over the California coastline like a suffocating heavy blanket of dread. The sky had completely mutated into a bruised, unnatural purple, entirely devoid of any natural sunlight, replaced instead by the chaotic, strobing flashes of distant, violent lightning. Inside the drafty, violently shuddering cabin of his rusted 1998 Ford pickup, Elias gripped the cracked leather steering wheel with terrifying force. His knuckles were bone white, the strained tendons in his forearms standing out in stark relief against his calloused, weathered skin. The freezing rain lashed against the fragile windshield in deafening, relentless sheets, a terrifying, omnipresent symphony of nature's raw wrath that threatened to completely shatter the safety glass at any given moment. The worn, loudly squeaking wiper blades struggled entirely uselessly against the absolute deluge, violently smearing the freezing water across his field of vision rather than clearing it. He was entirely, desperately focused on navigating the treacherous, slick black asphalt of the Pacific Coast Highway, a road that was rapidly transforming into a rushing river of thick mud and sharp debris. The visceral, guttural roar of the 100-mile-per-hour wind vibrated violently through the rusted, vibrating floorboards, rattling his teeth and sinking a biting, miserable chill deep into his marrow. Every single muscle in his battered, utterly exhausted body was coiled with extreme, painful urgency. He was desperate to return to the cramped, freezing apartment where his young daughter Maya waited entirely alone in the dark. He thought of her quietly drawing in her sketchbook by the dim light of a single battery-powered lantern, trusting him completely to come through that door. That singular, powerful image fueled his reckless push forward, forcing the screaming, overheating engine to its absolute mechanical limits. Miles away, perched dangerously close to the rapidly eroding granite bluffs, sat a sprawling, hyper-modern glass and steel mansion. It was a multi-million-dollar monument to human arrogance, a glowing fortress of sterile white light that stood in arrogant, stubborn defiance of the encroaching darkness. Inside the cavernous, impeccably decorated living room, Victoria Sterling paced the imported, highly polished Italian marble floors. She was a strikingly attractive woman, radiating an intimidating, cold elegance that commanded every room she entered. She was dressed for a lavish philanthropic gala that had just been canceled, wearing an incredibly expensive emerald green designer party dress. The silk fabric clung perfectly to her silhouette, featuring a dramatic, deep plunging neckline that highlighted a heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. She entirely ignored the blaring, high-pitched wail of the emergency evacuation sirens emitting from her platinum smartphone resting on a glass coffee table. The air inside her home was meticulously climate-controlled, entirely devoid of the violent metallic tang of ozone outside, smelling faintly of expensive aged scotch and blooming orchids. Despite the monstrous towering waves violently crashing against the jagged rocks hundreds of feet below, sending massive plumes of freezing sea spray high into the turbulent air, Victoria remained stubbornly anchored to her cutthroat corporate delusions. She barked aggressive, venomous commands into a wireless headset, entirely consumed by the minutiae of a ruthless corporate takeover. She blindly trusted that her immense, unfathomable wealth, her reinforced concrete foundation, and her hurricane-rated panoramic windows would permanently shield her from the atmospheric beast raging outside. The violent collision of these vastly disparate worlds began as the eye wall of the hurricane made landfall with unprecedented apocalyptic fury. The barometric pressure dropped instantly to record lows, popping ears and completely shattering the fragile illusion of safety. A massive, terrifying surge of flash floodwater suddenly breached the coastal highway's fragile concrete barriers just ahead of Elias. The surging, violent tide, thick with brown mud, jagged branches, and sharp debris, rushed violently across the asphalt in a deadly, unstoppable wave.
The truck's worn, balding tires lost all microscopic traction instantly. Hydroplaning violently, the heavy vehicle spun completely out of control. The horrifying screech of burning rubber was instantly drowned out by the howling gale. Elias braced for catastrophic impact as the world outside spun into a sickening blur of gray rain and black shadows. The truck violently, explosively slammed into a deep concrete drainage ditch. The visceral, bone-jarring crunch of crumpling steel echoed sharply through the storm. The dusty airbags deployed with a concussive, deafening blast, filling the crushed cabin with a suffocating, blinding cloud of white chemical dust. The ruined engine hissed aggressively, billowing thick, choking white steam into the freezing downpour. For a terrifying, suspended moment, there was only the agonizing sound of the rain hammering the mangled, smoking hood. Then, with a desperate groan, the crumpled driver's side door was forcefully kicked open from the inside. Coughing violently, spitting blood, and desperately clutching his severely bruised ribs, Elias dragged his battered body out into the razor-sharp teeth of the storm. The biting rain felt like thousands of icy needles against his skin, and the thick mud instantly sucked hungrily at his heavy boots. With the main roads entirely washed out and visibility reduced to mere feet, he realized with cold dread that his only chance for survival was to fight his way on foot towards the only beacon of light piercing the darkness, the glowing, isolated glass mansion on the cliffside.
The tempest raged with unrelenting, apocalyptic fury as Elias forced his way through the churning, viscous mud of the flooded coastal landscape. The dense, suffocating air was violently torn apart by 120-mile-per-hour wind gusts that felt like physical blows. These incredible gales carried the harsh, freezing sting of torrential rain, the distinct, earthy stench of uprooted ancient pines, and the metallic tang of destroyed electrical grids sparking dangerously in the distance. Forcing his way through the knee-deep freezing sludge, Elias battled against the insurmountable crushing force of the storm. Every single agonizing step was a monumental physical effort. His worn leather work boots sank heavily into the unstable, saturated earth that constantly threatened to swallow him whole with every shifting mudslide. The biting chill of the storm seeped into the very marrow of his bones, numbing his extremities until his fingers felt like blocks of dead wood. Yet the agonizing thought of his daughter waiting alone in the dark fueled a primal, unstoppable surge of adrenaline. Lightning violently fractured the pitch-black sky in a blinding, chaotic web of electric blue, instantly illuminating the terrifying apocalyptic landscape and throwing long, distorted, nightmarish shadows across his treacherous path. Rainwater cascaded down his rigid, clenched jawline as flying, jagged debris, splinters of wood, and chunks of asphalt grazed his bruised cheek. He locked his fierce gaze onto the solitary, defiant beacon of sterile white light emanating from the cliffside estate, pushing his battered, exhausted body past the absolute limits of human endurance. Inside the hyper-modern architectural fortress, the illusion of impenetrable, arrogant safety began to violently fracture under the immense weight of nature's wrath. The ambient temperature suddenly dropped to a freezing chill as the advanced HVAC systems completely failed, and the pristine, soundproofed walls shuddered violently under the massive atmospheric pressure. Standing rigidly amidst the imported Italian marble floors and stark minimalist decor, Victoria finally paused her manic pacing. A microscopic twitch of genuine primal dread broke her meticulously crafted, elegant facade. The reinforced floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, rated to withstand incredible blunt force, bowed ominously inward. They groaned with a terrifying, high-pitched metallic screech that reverberated right through the center of her chest, vibrating intensely against her ribs. The sterile, artificial lighting flickered violently, casting strobing, erratic shadows that made the expensive modern art on the walls look monstrous before plunging the cavernous living room into absolute, suffocating darkness. This was immediately followed by the concussive, explosive boom of a nearby massive transformer blowing out on the flooded highway. Panic, raw, unrefined, and entirely foreign to a woman who historically controlled absolutely everything in her life, suddenly seized her. She stood frozen, the delicate emerald silk of her deep-necked dress suddenly feeling incredibly thin and useless against the creeping cold of the dying house. The very foundation of the ancient cliffside began to emit a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated violently through the thin soles of her designer heels. The earth beneath the mansion had reached its absolute catastrophic saturation point. The cliff could simply hold no more water. With a deafening, world-ending crack that completely rivaled the loudest thunder overhead, the structural integrity of the coastal bluff completely and instantly failed. A massive, horrifying fissure tore directly through the manicured emerald lawn, swallowing ancient oak trees whole as thousands of tons of saturated earth, jagged rock, and liquefied mud instantly gave way to gravity. Half of the multi-million-dollar glass and steel mansion was violently sheared from its deep concrete foundation. The floor tilted violently beneath Victoria, sending her crashing painfully against a shattered glass table. The agonizing screeching of tearing steel beams and the explosive shattering of reinforced glass created a deafening cacophony of absolute destruction. The opulent structure plummeted down the sheer, jagged ravine, swallowed entirely by the roaring, churning black abyss of the flash flood raging below. Just reaching the fragile edge of the newly formed cataclysmic crater, Elias fell heavily to his bruised knees. His breath caught painfully in his throat as a suffocating, dense cloud of pulverized concrete and wet-smelling earth washed over him, choking him. As the blinding dust momentarily cleared, cutting sharply through the relentless, deafening howl of the hurricane and the chaotic, violent rushing of the deadly floodwaters below, Elias's ringing ears locked onto a sound that chilled him deeper than the freezing rain. It was a raw, desperate, and terrifyingly high-pitched human scream for help, echoing upward from the mangled, twisted wreckage trapped at the dark bottom of the treacherous ravine. The jagged, newly formed precipice of the cliffside dropped away into a chaotic abyss of churning black mud and mangled, twisted steel architecture that looked like a freshly bombed war zone. Staring down into the terrifying, roaring maw of the landslide, Elias felt the freezing, torrential rain violently lashing against his face, tasting the gritty, metallic soil on his chapped, bleeding lips. The deafening howl of the Category 5 hurricane actively attempted to drown out all human sound, but another raw, guttural cry of agony pierced the tempest, desperate and fading fast. Without a single second of hesitation, Elias threw his entire body over the treacherous edge, initiating a terrifying, uncontrolled slide down the highly unstable mud embankment. The descent was a brutal, violent assault on the senses. Razor-sharp shards of shattered tempered glass and jagged, splintered roots ruthlessly tore through the thick fabric of his jacket. He furiously dug his torn, bleeding fingers into the freezing, liquefied earth, desperately trying to arrest his freefall before he was impaled on the wreckage below. He crashed heavily into a massive pile of mangled, hyper-modern furniture at the bottom of the ravine, the wind violently knocked from his lungs in a painful, gasping wheeze that left him seeing stars. The bottom of the gorge was a claustrophobic, nightmarish graveyard of former luxury, rapidly filling with the surging, freezing tidal surge from the ocean. Waist-deep in the turbulent, debris-choked black water, Elias waded aggressively through the wreckage, his muscles burning with agonizing lactic acid and extreme cold. Following the faint, desperate whimpers, he pushed aside a floating leather sofa. Trapped helplessly beneath a massive, crushed structural titanium I-beam, Victoria struggled vainly against the crushing, immense weight pinning her lower legs. The freezing, murky floodwaters had already risen dangerously to her waist, the violent current actively threatening to sweep her entirely away into the dark ocean. Her incredibly expensive, deep-necked emerald party dress was completely ruined, soaked in freezing mud and snagged on twisted rebar, offering zero protection from the icy water. Her flawless dark hair was plastered to her pale face, and her previously impenetrable, arrogant facade had completely shattered into raw, unrefined panic. The freezing water violently splashed against the pale, utterly terrified face of the beautiful executive, her wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto her rescuer with a desperate, unspoken plea for salvation.
She was no longer a titan of industry. She was just a fragile woman facing the violent, terrifying end of her life. Refusing to succumb to the overwhelming, mathematically impossible odds, Elias desperately scanned the chaotic wreckage for any mechanical advantage. His hyper-focused gaze landed on a thick, shattered length of industrial steel piping protruding sharply from the ruined concrete foundation nearby. With a primal grunt of absolute exertion, Elias aggressively wrenched the heavy pipe free, dragging it through the waist-high freezing rapids. He wedged the jagged end of the steel pipe securely under the immovable titanium I-beam pinning Victoria, creating a desperate makeshift fulcrum against a solid, submerged slab of broken concrete. The water level continued to rise with terrifying speed, now lapping violently against Victoria's chest, filling the plunging neckline of her ruined dress with freezing mud and forcing her to tilt her head as far back as physically possible, gasping for the freezing, rain-soaked air. "Push!" screamed Elias over the deafening, monstrous roar of the raging flash flood. Every single sinew in his battered body strained to the absolute point of tearing. The tendons in his neck bulged dramatically, and thick veins pulsed visibly beneath his weathered, rain-slicked skin as he threw his entire body weight onto the makeshift steel lever. For an agonizing, terrifying second, the massive titanium beam refused to yield even a fraction of an inch. The leverage felt impossible, the weight of the house too immense for one man to move. Then, with a harsh, ear-piercing, grating screech of heavy metal agonizingly scraping against metal, the heavy structural beam shifted miraculously upward by just a few crucial inches. Utilizing the agonizing, microscopic gap, Victoria violently contorted her bruised, battered torso, desperately pulling her crushed legs free from the deadly trap, just milliseconds before a massive, surging wave of freezing brown water fully submerged the entire section of wreckage. Gasping violently and coughing up murky, foul-tasting floodwater, Victoria collapsed heavily into the freezing rapids, entirely devoid of strength. She was immediately caught and hauled to the muddy, highly unstable surface by the unyielding, overwhelmingly powerful grip of Elias, pulling her firmly away from the rising tide and toward the safety of the cliff wall.
The violent, roaring chaos of the flash flood churned ferociously below as the two survivors sought absolute refuge in a shallow, highly claustrophobic rocky alcove carved deep into the sheer, jagged side of the remaining granite cliff face. The rough stone walls dripped constantly with freezing, muddy rainwater, offering only a fragile, terrifying sanctuary from the Category 5 hurricane that continued to systematically and aggressively decimate the entire coastal landscape outside. The deafening, apocalyptic symphony of destruction, the agonizing screech of tearing metal from the wreckage below, and the booming, concussive cracks of ancient, massive trees snapping like tiny twigs reverberated violently within the tight, echoing confines of the cave. Huddled together in the suffocating, freezing darkness of the narrow stone cavity, the absolute, undeniable shift in worldly power was starkly illuminated by the sporadic, blinding, electric blue flashes of intense lightning. Victoria collapsed heavily and utterly defeated against the rough, unyielding granite wall. Her entire body violently convulsed with the dangerous, uncontrollable onset of severe, life-threatening hypothermia. Her multi-million-dollar global empire, her sprawling real estate portfolios, and her immense, untouchable corporate power were rendered completely meaningless against the raw, unforgiving, absolute brutality of nature. Her breathing was terrifyingly shallow and ragged, a painful wheezing rasp that echoed loudly, and her previously pristine lips were tinged with a terrifying, sickly blue hue as the freezing coastal wind mercilessly whipped through the jagged mouth of the alcove. Kneeling beside the broken, shivering executive, Elias entirely ignored the screaming, agonizing pain radiating from his own fractured ribs and deeply lacerated bloody knuckles. Operating on pure, unadulterated paternal instinct and a profound, unbreakable foundation of fundamental human empathy, Elias aggressively stripped off his heavy, rain-soaked brown canvas jacket.
Underneath, his battered body shivered violently in a thin, slightly drier thermal shirt that provided only a microscopic, practically useless barrier against the biting sub-zero wind chill. Without a single word of hesitation, regret, or judgment regarding the wealthy woman's earlier supreme arrogance, Elias wrapped the heavy, damp canvas jacket tightly around the quivering, battered shoulders of Victoria. The thin, wet silk of her ruined emerald dress, with its deep, plunging neckline, offered absolutely no insulation against the freezing air, leaving her skin dangerously exposed to the elements. He fiercely rubbed her freezing, rigid arms to generate life-saving, desperately needed friction and vital body heat. The coarse, wet fabric of the worn jacket smelled pungently of damp earth, cheap motor oil, and raw, exhausting sweat, but to Victoria it felt like an impenetrable, luxurious shield of divine grace. She fiercely clutched the rough lapels with bruised, desperately trembling hands, her wide, bloodshot eyes locking entirely onto the exhausted but intensely focused face of her unlikely savior. The contrast between them was absolute, yet the playing field had been brutally leveled.
"Why?"
rasped Victoria, her voice a broken, hollow, pathetic whisper entirely stripped of its former venomous, commanding authority. The deafening roar of the hurricane outside served as a terrifying, completely isolating soundtrack to her profound vulnerability and existential crisis. She confessed, her voice cracking with the agonizing, crushing weight of her ultimate realization that her relentless, cutthroat pursuit of unfathomable wealth had left her entirely, terrifyingly alone in the vast world. She admitted, hot tears of bitter regret finally mixing with the freezing rain on her pale cheeks, that not a single person in her vast corporate empire would have ever risked a single drop of blood to pull her from the muddy wreckage. They were loyal to her bank accounts and her power, not to her heartbeat. In gentle, quiet response, Elias reached deep into the dry inner pocket of his thermal shirt with bloody, shaking fingers and carefully pulled out a small, slightly crumpled, faded photograph. The photograph vividly depicted his young daughter, Maya, her bright, pure, innocent smile radiating an unmistakable, beautiful warmth that completely defied the freezing, apocalyptic gloom of the cavern. Gently tracing the frayed edge of the cherished photograph with a grimy, calloused thumb, Elias spoke at length of Maya, his low, steady voice cutting cleanly and beautifully through the chaotic, howling wind. He profoundly explained that his boundless love for her provided an unyielding, unbreakable strength that absolutely no bank account or lucrative stock portfolio could ever quantify or purchase. She was his entire world, his reason for waking up, and his absolute reason for refusing to die in that ravine. Listening to the absolute, unwavering conviction in the poor laborer's voice, Victoria felt the impenetrable, icy walls of her lifelong, miserable cynicism completely shatter. Sitting helplessly in the freezing mud, wearing the ruined remnants of a wildly expensive party dress, sustained entirely by the charity and unyielding grit of a man society usually actively renders invisible, the ruthless billionaire was profoundly, irreversibly humbled. She stared at him, realizing with absolute clarity the staggering, beautiful humanity of her true, absolute equal.
The cataclysmic, world-ending fury of the Category 5 hurricane finally, miraculously broke, leaving behind a profound, eerie, and unsettling silence that blanketed the utterly devastated, unrecognizable coastal landscape. The very first piercing rays of the brilliant morning sun violently sliced through the thick, lingering gray fog, casting a brilliant, hyper-realistic golden glow over the miles of shattered timber, deep muddy craters, and totally ruined million-dollar architecture. Inside the freezing, shallow granite alcove, the deafening thwack, thwack, thwack of a heavily armored United States Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter completely shattered the morning stillness. Its massive rotor wash violently whipped the damp air, sending microscopic droplets of freezing water dancing wildly in the bright sunlight. Huddled closely together in the suffocating dampness, Victoria and Elias slowly, painfully lifted their battered, totally exhausted faces toward the blinding, miraculous beam of the rescue helicopter's searchlight. The blinding white light violently washed over the heavily bruised, mud-streaked face of Victoria, revealing a profound, irreversible, and deeply profound psychological shift in her previously hardened, arrogant eyes. The ruthless, cutthroat billionaire who arrogantly and foolishly dismissed the blaring evacuation sirens the night before in her pristine emerald dress was completely, totally gone. She was replaced entirely by a profoundly humbled, raw human being who now intimately and painfully understood the fragile, microscopic thread of her own mortality and the invaluable worth of human compassion. As the heavily armored, bright orange rescue basket was systematically lowered deep into the treacherous muddy ravine by a thick steel cable, Elias pushed his agonizingly bruised body upward. His fractured ribs screamed in sharp, white-hot protest with every single labored breath he took. Despite his own extreme, overwhelming physical exhaustion, Elias fiercely gripped the shivering, battered shoulder of Victoria, physically guiding the trembling, broken executive toward the absolute safety of the swinging metal cage. The roaring downdraft of the powerful chopper blades created a deafening, chaotic vortex of wind and sound. But in this microscopic, deeply intimate moment of absolute survival, the vast, impenetrable socioeconomic chasm that previously completely separated the two completely evaporated into thin air. Before stepping securely into the metal rescue basket, Victoria aggressively grabbed the torn, actively bleeding hand of Elias. Her grip was impossibly strong and desperate, conveying an emotion she had never truly allowed herself to feel before. She did not offer a quiet, deeply insulting financial payout to ease a guilty conscience or purchase his silence. Instead, she stared deeply into the laborer's eyes with absolute, unshakable reverence, respect, and profound gratitude. The silent promise passing between them in that freezing ravine was infinitely stronger than any corporate contract she had ever signed. Weeks later, the visceral mud and freezing absolute terror of the ravine had been entirely replaced by the sterile, hyper-modern aesthetic of a towering, sun-drenched corporate boardroom overlooking the massive rebuilding efforts of the city. Standing tall at the head of a massive, flawlessly polished mahogany table, a physically recovered but fundamentally transformed Victoria addressed a massive room full of elite, completely silent executives. The ruthless predator of Wall Street had been washed away in the floodwaters. She looked radiant, dressed not for a frivolous gala, but in a sophisticated, incredibly sharp black designer corporate dress, still retaining a plunging neckline that spoke to her unshakable confidence, but worn now with a newfound gravity. She officially signed a thick, heavy stack of legally binding gold-embossed documents. With a firm, decisive stroke of her expensive pen, she permanently named Elias as the primary executive director of her newly minted multi-billion-dollar global disaster relief and massive community rebuilding initiative, a monumental project funded entirely by her personal fortune. Standing proudly beside her, wearing a newly tailored but very modest suit that sharply contrasted his rough, heavily calloused hands, Elias fully absorbed the life-altering, monumental shift in his entire reality. He knew deep in his soul that this unprecedented, incredible position permanently secured a brilliant, totally limitless future for his daughter Maya. She would never have to sit in the dark waiting for him to survive a storm again. Two vastly different people, born to completely opposite ends of a horribly fractured, deeply unequal world, had walked straight into the deadly, roaring mouth of the absolute worst storm of the century. But through the terrifying crucible of absolute destruction and the staggering raw power of unexpected human compassion, they walked out bound together, ready to actively rebuild the world.